I stood in the center of the village square, my body shaking, my face wet with tears. The eyes of the villagers burned into me, some with pity, others with anger, and many with disbelief. The chief sat on his high stool, his face unreadable. The elders whispered among themselves. My mother knelt beside me, her hands shaking as she clutched my arm. "Tell us again what you just said, child," the chief commanded, his voice heavy with authority. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to say it one more time. "My reverend father got me pregnant." A sharp gasp swept through the crowd, followed by murmurs of shock and outrage. Some people covered their mouths. Others shook their heads in disbelief. "Liar!" someone shouted. "Impossible!" another voice rang out. I flinched, but I held my ground. "I'm not lying." My voice cracked, but I didn't care. No one believed me before, but now you have no choice. Because today, I turned to the side, pointing at the church doors. Today, the truth will walk through that door. The villagers turned as one, eyes fixed on the wooden doors of the grand church that stood in the middle of the village. The air was thick with tension. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Any moment now, the proof of my words would reveal itself, and no one, would be able to deny it anymore. But let me take you back to how it all started. I was just a simple girl, living in a quiet village where people trusted each other blindly. My mother raised me alone after my father died, and we didn't have much. She worked hard, selling fruits in the market while I helped where I could. The church was the center of our village, and the Reverend Father was the most respected man in town. He was holy, wise, and everyone believed he could do no wrong. He helped the poor, prayed for the sick, and gave sermons that left people in awe. I had always admired him too. He was kind to me, always smiling when he saw me at church. He told my mother that I was a special child, that I had a bright future. And when he offered to help pay for my education, my mother wept with joy, thanking God for the blessing. At first, everything seemed like a dream come true. I got to spend more time at the church, learning things I never imagined I would. The Reverend Father was patient, always guiding me, always telling me how proud he was. But then, little things started happening. I would catch him looking at me for too long. Sometimes, his hand would linger when he touched my shoulder. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, this was the Reverend Father, the holiest man in the village. Then one evening, he called me into his private chambers. He told me he had something important to discuss. I went in, not suspecting a thing. But the moment the door shut behind me, something changed. His face, his voice, his whole presence felt different. I remember every single moment of that night. How he walked toward me slowly. How he whispered that I was beautiful. How his hands gripped my arms. How I tried to pull away. How I screamed, but no one heard me. How my world shattered. When I ran home, I told my mother everything. I expected her to hold me, to believe me, to fight for me. But instead, she slapped me across the face. "Do you know what you are saying?" she cried. "You dare accuse a man of God?" I shook my head, desperate. "I'm telling the truth, Mama." But she wouldn't listen. No one did. I tried telling some women in the village, but they laughed in my face. "Why would the Reverend Father touch a girl like you?" one of them sneered. The worst part was when I missed my monthly flow. I knew what it meant before the village healer even confirmed it. I was carrying his child. And that was when my nightmare truly began. People called me a liar, a disgrace, a devil trying to destroy a man of God. My mother refused to speak to me, too ashamed to even look at me. Some elders in the village said I should be cast out for telling such a wicked lie. And then, the Reverend Father himself stood before the church congregation and told them I was possessed by evil spirits. He said I was spreading dangerous lies, and everyone believed him. I thought my life was over. Until today. Because today, as the church doors creak open, the proof of my words will be revealed. And no one will ever be able to deny it again. The wooden doors of the church groaned as they swung open. The entire village held its breath, eyes fixed on the entrance. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I gripped my dress with trembling hands, waiting for the moment that would change everything. And then, A figure stepped forward. A woman. She was old, with a face lined with years of wisdom and suffering. Her back was slightly bent, but her eyes, those eyes, were sharp and filled with something I couldn't describe. She was the midwife, the only one who knew what had truly happened. Gasps rippled through the crowd as she walked in, her cane tapping against the stone floor. The Reverend Father's face, which had been calm and composed all this time, suddenly changed. He gripped the edge of his robe. The midwife raised her hand, silencing the murmurs. She turned to the chief and elders. "I have kept silent long enough," she said, her voice steady. "But today I will speak." The Reverend Father opened his mouth, but before he could say anything, she turned to the villagers and said the words that sent a shockwave through the square. "This girl is telling the truth." The crowd erupted. Some people gasped, some shouted, and others looked at the Reverend Father in horror. I saw my mother clutch her chest. The midwife turned to the chief. "When this girl came to me, she was with child. I examined her myself." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "And I know exactly who the father is." The Reverend Father took a step back, his hands shaking. "This is madness." "Lies. This woman is old. She doesn't know what she's saying." His voice had lost its usual calmness. He was afraid. For the first time since my nightmare began, I saw fear in his eyes. But before I could take in what was happening, someone in the crowd screamed. And that was when I saw her. A woman. Pale, thin, and weak, stumbling toward us from the back of the square. Her hair was matted, her clothes torn. She looked like a ghost. And when she lifted her head, I felt my knees buckle. It was the Reverend Father's housemaid. She had disappeared months ago. No one knew where she went. People whispered that she had run away, that she had stolen from the church and fled. But now, here she was, looking like she had been through hell. She pointed a trembling finger at the Reverend Father. "He did the same thing to me," she croaked. "And when I told him, he sent me away." Chaos broke loose. Women screamed. Men shouted. People turned on the Reverend Father, their whispers turning to anger. But before anyone could act, he ran. The Reverend Father turned on his heels and bolted through the crowd, shoving people aside as he sprinted toward the church. The chief shouted for the guards. The villagers chased after him. I stood frozen in place, my heart slamming against my chest. I had waited so long for this moment, but I never imagined it would happen like this. Then, without thinking, I ran too. I ran toward the church, toward the truth, toward the man who had ruined my life. And as I burst through the church doors after him, I had no idea what I would find inside. I burst through the church doors, my breath ragged, my legs shaking. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind me, sealing me inside with the man who had stolen everything from me. The church was dark except for the flickering candlelight near the altar. The air was thick with the scent of burning wax and old wood. My eyes darted across the empty pews until they landed on him, the Reverend Father. He stood at the altar, his back to me, his hands gripping the sacred cloth that covered the altar table. His shoulders rose and fell as he breathed heavily, his once pristine robe now wrinkled and disheveled. "You shouldn't have done this," he said, his voice low, almost shaking. I clenched my fists. "I shouldn't have done this," I repeated, my voice trembling with anger. "You should never have touched me. You should never have done what you did." He turned around slowly, his face no longer the calm and holy mask he always wore in public. Now, I saw something else. Fear, anger, desperation. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I was weak. I am only a man." I took a step closer, my heart hammering. "You were supposed to protect me. You were supposed to guide me. Instead, you destroyed me." A flash of something dark crossed his face. "And what do you think will happen now?" He gestured toward the church doors. "Do you think those villagers outside will be merciful? They will tear me apart. They will make me suffer." I stepped back. "You deserve it." His lips twisted into a bitter smile. "Maybe I do," he admitted. "But what about you?" He pointed at my stomach, his voice turning cold. "You carry my child. That makes you part of this. Do you really think they will see you as a victim forever? I swallowed hard, his words sinking in. He took a step forward. The world is cruel, my child. Today they believe you. Tomorrow they will hate you. Soon they will call you cursed. Do you really think they will let you live in peace with that child? I felt something tighten in my chest. Deep down, I knew there was some truth in his words. In our village, an unmarried mother was already a disgrace, but to carry the child of a man the people had once worshipped? I had no idea what my future held. But then, I shook my head. No, I whispered. I will not let fear control me anymore. You made me afraid once. Never again. He chuckled darkly. Then you are a fool. Before I could react, he lunged. I gasped as his hands wrapped around my throat, shoving me against the altar. The candles shook from the impact, casting wild shadows on the walls. You ruined me, he hissed, his grip tightening. You destroyed everything. I clawed at his hands, trying to pry them off. The world around me started to blur. My lungs burned. But then, bang! The church doors burst open, and the villagers poured in. Gasps filled the air. Someone screamed. Then, before the Reverend Father could react, strong hands yanked him off me and threw him to the ground. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, as I watched the villagers swarm around him, grabbing his arms, his legs, dragging him away. His screams echoed through the church, mixing with the shouts of the people. I didn't move. I just knelt there, my fingers trembling, my throat aching. It was over. Or so I thought. Because just as the villagers dragged him outside, just as the night air filled with cries for justice, the ground beneath us began to shake. A deep, rumbling sound filled the air. The church walls trembled. And then, the giant bell from the church tower snapped loose and came crashing down. Screams filled the night as the massive bell plummeted straight toward us. And in that split second, I realized. It was heading right for me. The massive church bell plummeted through the air, its deafening roar drowning out the screams of the villagers. Time seemed to slow as I stared at the deadly weight hurtling toward me. My body froze, my mind screamed at me to move, but my legs wouldn't obey. Then, a pair of strong arms wrapped around me and yanked me backward. The bell crashed into the ground just inches from where I had been, sending a shockwave through the church. Dust and debris exploded into the air, choking my vision. I coughed violently, struggling to breathe, my heart slamming against my ribs. When the dust settled, I turned to see who had saved me. It was my mother. Her face was streaked with tears, her body trembling as she held me close. I thought I lost you, she sobbed, gripping me tightly. For the first time in months, I saw it in her eyes, regret. But before I could speak, another scream rang through the air. The villagers had scattered in all directions, but at the center of the chaos, the Reverend Father lay sprawled beneath the wreckage. The bell hadn't landed on him fully, but his legs were trapped under its massive weight. Blood seeped into the cracks of the church floor. He groaned, his face twisted in agony. The people stood around him, watching, whispering, some afraid, some angry. No one moved to help him. The chief stepped forward, his voice firm. The gods have spoken. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. The Reverend Father's breathing was ragged as he looked around at the people who had once worshipped him. Please, he gasped, his voice weaker than I had ever heard it. Help me. Silence. Then, the housemaid stepped forward. The woman he had cast away, who had suffered at his hands just like me. She stared down at him with an unreadable expression. You never helped me, she whispered. When I begged you to listen, you turned me away. When I told you I was with child, you threw me out like garbage. A hush fell over the villagers. The Reverend Father groaned, trying to move, but the weight on his legs was too much. I was wrong, he choked out. I was weak. But I am still a man of God. You cannot let me die here. A bitter laugh escaped the housemaid's lips. You used God's name to hide your sins. And now, even he will not listen to you. The Reverend Father turned desperate eyes toward the chief, the elders, the villagers, even my mother. But no one came forward. And then, he turned to me. My blood ran cold as our eyes met. Help me, he pleaded. Please, my child. 1,000 emotions surged through me: rage, pain, fear. He had taken everything from me. My innocence, my peace, my trust. He had left me alone in my suffering while he stood at the altar, pretending to be a holy man. And yet, here he was, begging for my mercy. I stepped forward, my entire body trembling. I looked down at the man who had ruined my life. You called me a liar, I whispered. You called me possessed. You let them turn against me. Tears filled my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. I bent down, just enough for him to hear me. You don't deserve my help, I said. His eyes widened. For the first time, true fear filled them. I stood up straight and turned away. The villagers followed my lead. One by one, they turned their backs on him. The chief gave a final nod before signaling the guards to leave. The last thing I heard before the doors of the church closed behind us was his scream. I don't know how long he lasted. But I do know that when the sun rose the next morning, the church bell was still there. And he was not. The village never spoke of him again. Days turned into weeks. Life moved on. My mother finally looked me in the eyes again. She never said the words, but I knew she was sorry. But even with the Reverend Father gone, my suffering wasn't over. Because I was still carrying his child. And as my stomach grew, so did the whispers. I could feel it. The villagers who had stood by me that night were beginning to change. Their pity turned to discomfort. Their sympathy turned to judgment. And one day, I overheard two women talking. We stood with her because she was a victim, one of them murmured. But now, she is bringing the child of a cursed man into our village. My heart clenched. I thought I had won. But the real battle was only just beginning. Because now, I wasn't just fighting for my own life. I was fighting for my child's. And I had no idea if I could win. The days after the Reverend Father's death were not the peaceful ones I had imagined. At first, the villagers treated me kindly. They nodded when they passed me at the market, greeted my mother with warmth, even offered me small gifts, fruits, bread, pieces of cloth. But as my belly grew, so did the distance between us. The whispers began softly. Averted eyes, hurried conversations that ended the moment I walked into a room. Then the looks, pity at first, but soon replaced by something else. Fear. Disgust. Suspicion. I wasn't just a girl anymore. I was the one carrying his child. It started with the women. I noticed it when I went to fetch water one evening. The village well was always busy at dusk, filled with laughter and gossip. But when I arrived, the chatter stopped. The women glanced at my belly, then at each other. "Let's go," one of them murmured, and just like that, they left, leaving their half-filled buckets behind, as if my very presence had tainted the water. I stood there, gripping the wooden handle of my own bucket, staring at the rippling surface of the well. They feared me. No, they feared my child. By the time I returned home, my mother's face was pale. She had heard. She always heard. The village never let her forget. "You need to be careful," she said one night as she prepared our evening meal. "People are starting to think," she stopped herself, but I knew what she meant. "They think my child is cursed," I finished for her. She didn't look at me. She didn't have to. I had seen the way some villagers touched their charms when I walked past. How some of the elders avoided looking me in the eye. They had turned against the Reverend Father. They had believed my pain. But now, they saw me as a reminder of him, a piece of his sin still growing inside me. A sin they did not want in their village. The fear turned into something worse. It started small. My mother's basket of fruits at the market overturned when no one was near it. Our laundry, which we had hung to dry, found torn and scattered by the wind, except there was no wind that night. The village children, once eager to play near our home, no longer came near. Then came the night I woke up to a dead chicken nailed to our door. My mother gasped when she saw it. Her hands flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. I stood frozen, staring at the lifeless bird, its eyes wide and empty, its body hanging limp. A warning. A message. They wanted me gone. That same night, my mother made me sit by the fire. Her eyes were filled with something I had never seen before, pure terror. "We must leave," she whispered. "Before they force us to." I shook my head. "Leave? Where would we go?" She reached for my hands, squeezing them tightly. "Somewhere. Anywhere. We cannot stay here, child. The village will not let you bring that baby into this world." I pulled away. "No. This is my home. Our home. I will not run." Her eyes filled with tears. "You don't understand. They are afraid of the child. They believe it carries his spirit, that it will bring a curse upon the village." I stood. "Then let them be afraid." My voice shook with anger. "I will not hide. This child is mine. I will not let them take that away from me." My mother flinched at my outburst. I rarely raised my voice at her, but I was tired. Tired of being afraid. Tired of running. Tired of letting people decide my fate. She sighed, wiping her face. "Then you must be ready for what comes next." I didn't know what she meant at the time, but I found out soon enough. Because 3 nights later, as I lay in bed, listening to the soft chirping of crickets outside, I smelled smoke. I sat up, my heart hammering. The air was thick, heavy, suffocating. I coughed, blinking against the darkness. Then I saw it. The glow outside our window. Flickering orange, dancing shadows against the walls. Fire. I jumped from my bed, running toward the door, but my mother was already ahead of me, throwing open the wooden latch. And what we saw outside made my blood run cold. The villagers were standing there, torches in their hands. Their faces were unreadable, masked by the flame's glow. Some looked guilty, others determined. But they were all there, waiting. My mother grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "It's time," she whispered. My legs felt like stone, but I forced myself forward. I stepped out into the night, facing the people I had known my whole life. The chief stood at the front. His expression was grim, but there was no anger in his eyes. Only certainty. "You cannot stay," he said simply. I looked at the fire in his hand, at the others behind him, at the way my mother clutched my wrist as if she could stop the inevitable. They didn't need to say the words. They weren't giving me a choice. I had won against the Reverend father. But now, I had lost everything else. I was no longer a girl of this village. I was no longer welcome. I was being cast out. The night air burned my lungs as I looked one last time at my home, at the only life I had ever known. And with a final breath, I turned, and I walked into the darkness. Alone. Carrying the child no one wanted. The night swallowed me whole. I walked for hours, my feet dragging through the dirt, my stomach twisting with hunger and fear. The weight of my unborn child pressed against me, reminding me that I was no longer just walking for myself, I was walking for two. I didn't know where I was going. I had never left the village before. I had only ever known its people, its land, its safety, even when that safety had turned against me. Now I was nowhere, and I was alone. Except for my mother. She had followed me. She hadn't spoken since we left. Not when the village disappeared behind us, not when the torches faded into the distance, not when my legs gave out and I fell to my knees in the middle of the road, sobbing into my hands. She simply knelt beside me, rubbing my back, whispering words I barely heard. "We will find a way," she said. I wanted to believe her. But how could I? The world had turned against me. I carried the child of a man everyone wanted to forget. Who would take us in? Who would shelter a girl with a belly full of shame? But I had no choice. I had to survive. I had to keep moving. I pushed myself up, wiped my face, and started walking again. Dawn was breaking by the time we reached the river. The sky was painted in soft pinks and purples, the water glistening under the rising sun. My mother helped me kneel by the edge, where I splashed the cool water on my face, washing away the dirt and tears. And then I saw it. A reflection. Not mine. A woman stood on the other side of the river. She was watching us. I froze, gripping my mother's arm. The woman wore a long flowing cloth wrapped around her body, her dark hair braided neatly down her back. Her eyes were piercing, deep and knowing. She did not look afraid of us. She did not look disgusted. She simply stepped forward and spoke. "You have been cast out," she said, her voice strong. "But you are not lost." I swallowed hard. "Who are you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she tilted her head, her eyes dropping to my swollen belly. "You carry more than a child," she said. "You carry the truth of what was done to you. And that truth is powerful." A lump formed in my throat. Powerful. I shook my head. "It has only brought me pain." The woman stepped closer, stopping just at the river's edge. "Pain is only the beginning," she said. "It does not have to be the end." I didn't know what to say. She studied me for a long moment. Then, she raised a hand and pointed behind her, toward the trees beyond the river. "There is a village ahead," she said. "They do not know you. They do not know your story. But they know suffering. They know what it means to be cast aside." My breath hitched. A new village. A new chance. I turned to my mother, searching her face. She was crying. But for the first time in months, they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of hope. I turned back to the woman, my heart pounding. "Will they take me in?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She held my gaze. "That is up to you." She turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I watched until I couldn't see her anymore. Then, I looked at my mother. She nodded. And together, we crossed the river. Years later, when my child was old enough to understand, I told them the truth. I told them about the man who hurt me. I told them about the village that turned against me. I told them about the fire, the torches, the whispers that followed me even as I walked into the night. But I also told them about the woman by the river. The one who pointed me toward a new beginning. The one who reminded me that pain is not the end. That truth is powerful. That I survived. And that they, my child, were not a curse. They were my strength. They were my hope. And no matter what the world said, they would never be unwanted again.